Hi everyone, my name's Chris and I'm an alcoholic. Welcome to this Illustrated Steps workshop. We've been sober for many years and have been presenting these workshops for a lot of those years. These workshops are our way of practicing Step 12. We carry the message by passing on the information that was given to us by older members and from the Big Book when we were first getting sober. Tonight we're going to be looking at steps 2 and 3, and I'll pass you over to David because there's a lot to get through.
Hi, my name's David. I'm an alcoholic. And last week we started looking at the steps, step 1 in particular. And so step 1 is this one. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. And we talked about the two aspects that are discussed in the AA Big Book. The first being the physical aspect of the illness. The basis of this illness is a physical difference between me and most other people. Most people can have a few drinks, but they get to a point where they're able to say, no thanks, I've had enough. Whenever I started drinking, it tended to go out of control because when I had one or two, I get a craving to keep going and keep going. And that's the thing that sets me apart from the average drinker. As well as that, it's also a progressive disease. So over time, it gets worse. And I start drinking more and more, and it starts interfering with all sorts of parts of my life because I start lying and covering up, and I can't control how much. And I keep on trying to control it. Over time, it gets worse, and I start getting all these other problems, relationship problems, financial problems, social problems, and family problems, and health problems, and possibly legal problems. And eventually, an alcoholic like me gets to a point, I look at my life and I say, look, my drinking's out of control. It's causing all these problems. So I come up with this really bright idea. I'll give up drinking. And for someone like me, that's a really smart idea. In fact, a really sane idea. If every time I start drinking, it goes out of control, the smart thing to do, the sane thing to do, is to stop drinking. And so that's what I would do. I'd make that decision. Now, I found it really hard to actually do that on my own because of the physical dependency part of it. So I would need to get help. And for me, that meant getting medical help. And lots of us need that to varying degrees. We need help in those initial few days to get it out of our system, get past that initial detox. But I would get that help and I would stop. Then the next question is, can I stay stopped? And then I found out about the other part that AA talked about, this obsession with alcohol. So I would stop drinking and life would tend to get better because I start fixing up some of those problems and I'm showing up to work on time. My health's improving. I'm not lying and covering up. Relationships are improving. More money in my pocket. But at the same time, there's this obsession, this thought of a drink keeps on coming back. Even after I've stopped for a while, the thoughts of drinking keep returning. There's that urge that to go back and do it again. And I'd resist that and I'd resist that. And then one day I'd forget about all the bad things that used to happen when I was drinking, or I'd go into denial, or I'd come up with some sort of excuse, or somehow I'd go back and pick it up again. And when I picked it up again, that craving would kick in. So I'd do the insane thing and pick it up again. This became this cycle. Round and round I went of really desperately wanting to stop, stopping for a little while, life would get better, and then I'd pick it up again, and it'd all fall apart. And when I came to AA and particularly read the book, and it used this word over and over again, insanity. It's that moment just before I pick up a drink where I forget about what the consequences are going to be, and I pick it up. I didn't know there was other people like me who couldn't stop and stay stopped because of this obsession and the insanity.
Now, when I did most of my drinking, I did it in a very small country town in north central Victoria and ran out of excuses and ran out of people to feel sorry for me and just ran out of luck. And I couldn't stay stopped drinking. And it was devastating. Lost jobs, I lost friendships, and I lost my respect and dignity. I'd lost 2 of my children beforehand. My ex-husband had come and taken them away, and I still had 2 teenage daughters with me. So I got to a point where I knew that I had to change something. And I said to my girls, come with me to a bigger city, bigger town, and our lives will get better. And they said, we will come with you, Mum, if you don't drink. And I said, that's fine. I don't want to drink, you know. And we went to this town this city really, and things got better. I didn't drink. I got this new flat. I put them into school. Things weren't perfect, but there was no reason to drink. There was no excuse. And I remember saying to Wendy and Melissa, I'm going down and get some bread and milk. And that was my intention. I had no thought of a drink, whatever. And I can't even remember buying it. And this is well before I came into AA. I was really desperately trying to stop drinking, and I used the best thing I had in my resources was my willpower, and I thought that would get me through. As I said, I can't remember buying it, but I can remember walking in the back door, and I've got a cast one and half a dozen cans, and the looks on my daughter's faces, because they said to me, "You said you weren't going to do this again." And I said, "The only thing I could come up with, you don't understand." Because the baffling thing was that I didn't understand either. And Wendy was crying and rocking in the corner, and Melissa was yelling and screaming at me. So any harmony that we had in that home was gone again. And I can't even remember thinking, I'm going to buy that. I need that. I want that. I just went and did it. And that really baffled me. That frightened me. Here I was putting the most powerful thing I thought I had was my willpower again, but this time I was determined. This time I really meant it, and I failed. And to me, that's that insanity. Knowing what was going to happen and doing it anyway. And it was frightening to me and to my girls.
Because of the craving, I'm powerless after the first drink. And because of the obsession, I'm powerless before the first drink. And that means that I'm powerless over alcohol and my life becomes unmanageable. And the first step is simply admitting that that's true. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives have become unmanageable. That's that recognition of insanity. I make the sane decision not to do it, and I do the insane thing of picking it up. Now, the thing about the first step is there's no hope in the first step. The first step doesn't fix my problem. The first step is the realization that I can't stop and stay stop on my own. So there's no hope in the first step. The hope comes in step 2 and the rest of the 12-step program. So if I'm powerless over alcohol, step 2 suggests that we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. So step 2 is about sanity. It's the promise of sanity. So what hope does step 2 offer? Well, I'm going to go back to the AA book. This is the book that was written when the first 100 members of AA got sober. In it is the story of this guy. This guy's name is Roland. He's not a member of AA, and in fact, he was never a member of AA. He was an alcoholic that got sober before AA started, and his story is fundamental to the creation of AA. His name isn't used in the book. He's just described as a businessman. This is what the big book says about Roland.
A certain American businessman had ability, good sense, and high character. For years he had floundered from one sanitarium to another. He had consulted the best-known American psychiatrists. Then he had gone to Europe, placing himself in the care of a celebrated physician, the psychiatrist Dr. Jung, who prescribed for him. Though experience had made him sceptical, he finished his treatment with unusual confidence. His physical and mental condition were unusually good. Above all, he believed he'd acquired such a profound knowledge of the inner workings of his mind and its hidden springs that relapse was unthinkable. Nevertheless, he was drunk in a short time. More baffling still, he could give himself no satisfactory explanation for his fall. So he returned to this doctor whom he admired and asked him point blank why he could not recover. He wished above all things to regain self-control. He seemed quite rational and well-balanced with respect to other problems, yet he had no control whatever over alcohol. And why was this? He begged the doctor to tell him the whole truth, and he got it. In the doctor's judgment, he was utterly hopeless. He could never regain his position in society, and he would have to place himself under lock and key or hire a bodyguard if he expected to live long. That was the great physician's opinion.
There's Roland, and he's described as having ability, good sense, even a high character. He's well-balanced and rational regarding everything else except this one thing, alcohol. And he's absolutely baffled by it, why he can't stop and stay stopped. He goes and sees the top psychiatrist in North America at the time. He still keeps on relapsing. Fortunately for Roland, he and his family were quite wealthy. So they said, well, who's the best psychiatrist in the world? We're going to see the best. And so they said, oh, well, Carl Jung. You would have heard of Carl Jung. He's still famous. So Roland went over to Europe, was treated by Carl Jung. He came out of that experience thinking, now I understand the way my mind works and I won't drink again. But then soon after, he relapsed again. And he went back to Jung and he said, what's going on here? This is what he said about Roland.
The doctor said, "You have the mind of a chronic alcoholic. I've never seen one single case recover where that state of mind existed to the extent that it does in you." Our friend felt as though the gates of hell had closed on him with a clang. He said to the doctor, "Is there no exception?" "Yes," replied the doctor, "there is. Exceptions to cases such as yours have been occurring since early times. Here and there, once in a while, alcoholics have had what are called vital spiritual experiences. To me, these occurrences are phenomena. They appear to be in the nature of huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. Ideas, emotions, and attitudes, which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men, are suddenly cast to one side, and a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate them. In fact, I've been trying to produce some such emotional rearrangement within you. With many individuals, the methods which I employed are successful, but I have never been successful with an alcoholic of your description."
So he doesn't give him a lot of hope. Here he is, the most prominent psychiatrist in the world. He's saying, I have never seen an alcoholic of your description recover. Not a lot of hope in that. Does give him a glimmer of hope, though. He says occasionally through history, there'll be an alcoholic who has some sort of what he calls a vital spiritual experience. But he also says, I don't know how to make that happen. If I knew how to give you that experience, that I would. I know it happens, but I can't give it to you. I went looking for an example that these guys would have known about this. And I came across this guy. This guy's name is Matthew Talbot. He was an Irish alcoholic who got sober back in the 1890s. So more than 50 years before AA, Matthew Talbot got sober. He was hanging around outside the pub one night. He'd run out of money. He was trying to convince someone else to buy him a drink, and no one would. So instead, he went down to the local cathedral and went to mass and prayed to stop drinking. And he stopped drinking, and it was such a rare occasion, a rare thing for an Irish alcoholic to get sober, that he was actually held up as an example by the Catholic Church. Be like Matthew Talbot. He became very religious and pious and went to mass every day. And then he started paying back money to people that he'd stolen from, making amends. And he stayed sober for the rest of his life. The thing was, he wasn't actually able to help someone else because he didn't have a program to pass on to anyone else. But it was something that the Catholic Church held up. This is an alcoholic who was able to stop through a spiritual experience. He was so famous, there's a bridge in Dublin with a statue in his honour. And even to this day, right throughout the world, there are institutions, usually Catholic institutions, named after Matthew Talbot. In Sydney, there's the Matthew Talbot Hostel, which is a homeless men's hostel in central Sydney. If you go to some of the meetings around Woolloomooloo, you'll often hear AA members who say, that was my rock bottom when I ended up homeless in the Matthew Talbot Hostel. And so that's what Jung's talking about. He's saying, I've never seen an alcoholic like you, a chronic alcoholic like you, recover, but I do know it occasionally happens through some sort of spiritual path. Roland got some hope from that. He went back to the US and came across a religious group that was prominent at the time called the Oxford Groups, going around preaching their particular values and trying to recruit members. They weren't particularly interested in alcoholics. Roland got involved with this group and they had a set of practices. These were the practices of the Oxford Group. So admission of personal defeat, taking of personal inventory, confession of one's sins to another person, making restitution to those one's harmed, helping others selflessly, and praying to God for guidance and the power to put these precepts into practice. Now, if you look at those and what eventually became the AA 12 steps, you can see there's a whole lot of similarities. So Roland went through that process of admitting defeat and he took an inventory. He shared his inventory with someone else. He became willing to change. He became willing to make amends and he got sober. Now, around the same time in New York, this guy's name is Ebby. We know him in AA as Ebby T. He was another alcoholic. He was about to be locked up. But some people from the Oxford Group went along to the court with him and said to the magistrate, look, this guy's an alcoholic like us and we might be able to help him. And fortunately for Ebby, the magistrate was the uncle of one of those Oxford Group members. And so he said yes. And so they took him along to the Oxford Group and Ebby went through that process as well of admitting defeat, and he took an inventory. He shared his inventory with Roland. He became willing to change. He became willing to make amends. And Ebby got sober as well. In fact, there was just this small handful of people who had got sober with this Oxford Group. The same time in New York as this guy. This guy's name's Bill, and he eventually founded AA. His story is the very first chapter of the AA book. Immediately after the doctor's opinion, Bill's story. And it describes Bill. Bill's a very ambitious and smart, capable guy. In fact, he made himself a multi-millionaire. He was very successful in a lot of ways while he was drinking. But when you read his story, you can see that alcohol starts playing a much bigger part in his life. In the end, it all falls apart. I'm going to read a part of his story in the middle when things are starting to get really bad.
Liquor ceased to be a luxury. It became a necessity. Bathtub gin, 2 bottles a day, and often 3, got to be routine. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100s, and I would pay my bills at the bars and delicatessens. This went on endlessly, and I began to waken very early in the morning, shaking violently. A tumbler full of gin, followed by half a dozen bottles of beer, would be required if I were to eat any breakfast. Nevertheless, I still thought I could control the situation, and there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hope. Gradually things got worse. The house was taken over by the mortgage holder, my mother-in-law died, my wife and father-in-law became ill. Then I got a promising business opportunity. Stocks were at the low point of 1932, and I'd somehow formed a group to buy. I was to share generously in the profits. Then I went on a prodigious bender, and that chance vanished. I woke up. This had to be stopped. I saw I could not take so much as one drink. I was through forever. Before then, I'd written lots of sweet promises, but my wife happily observed that this time I meant business, and so I did. Shortly afterward, I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way, and I had taken it. Was I crazy? I began to wonder, for such an appalling lack of perspective seemed near being just that.
So there's Bill, another smart, capable guy, stock trader, and things are getting worse. And he gets to a point where he says, that's it, this has to be stopped. I saw I couldn't take so much as one drink. I'm through forever. Sounds like your story.
Does.
And then, see, shortly afterwards, I came home drunk. No reason, no explanation. This is the baffling part of it. At this point, Bill starts to realise that he's powerless. He starts to wonder, am I crazy? So this is the inkling of step one. He starts to wonder, am I crazy? And for the next 2 years, he keeps trying to stop drinking. He goes into hospital. He meets Dr. Silkworth, who explains the illness to him. He thinks, now I know about the illness and the craving. That knowledge will keep me sober, but it didn't. He relapsed again over and over and identified with that cycle of getting worse and spiralling down. And he gets to a point where he's not able to work at all. He's given up giving up almost. And he gets a phone call from his old schoolmate, Ebby, who says, I'm in town, can I come and see you? And Bill thinks, fantastic, I won't need to drink alone. I'll have a drink with Ebby. So Ebby comes round and they sat at this kitchen table. This is the actual kitchen table they sat at. Some people thought this meeting was so important that they'd preserve the kitchen table in a museum outside of New York. And Bill offers Ebby a drink, and Ebby says, no, I'm not drinking. I'm not drinking because I've found God with the Oxford group. This is what Bill said about it.
But my friend sat before me and they made the point-blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. His human will had failed. Doctors had pronounced him incurable. Society was about to lock him up. Like myself, he had admitted complete defeat. Then he had, in effect, been raised from the dead, suddenly taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he had ever known. Had this power originated in him? Obviously it had not. There had been no more power in him than there was in me at the minute, and this was none at all.
So Bill's amazed that Ebby's sober, and he's once again reiterating this part about being powerless. He's sort of saying, Ebby used to be just as powerless as I am, and right now I'm powerless. So that first step is admitting we're powerless. And for some of us, the big obstacle to the first step is denial and dishonesty. Now, Bill's got that past that point. He's no longer in denial. He knows he's an alcoholic. He wants to stop. He's just baffled by the fact that he can't. Step two is believing that there's a spiritual solution. And the big obstacle to step two, for some of us, not all of us, is prejudice against spiritual ideas. And lots of people, myself included, come into AA and identify with the problem, identify with the craving, identify with the obsession, identify with the insanity of picking up a drink again and again. And I go, that's me. And then they say, we've got a solution and it's a spiritual solution. And I go, that's not me. I don't do spiritual. Okay, I've rejected that a long time ago. Bill had quite a negative reaction to this as well. This is what he said.
Despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as creative intelligence, universal mind, or spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of a Tsar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. I've since talked with scores of men who felt the same way.
So Bill has this negative reaction to that, and he acknowledges that happens to lots of people that come into AA. You get this negative reaction to an idea of a spiritual way of life. But what happens next is that Eddie comes up with something different. This is what he says.
My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, "Why don't you choose your own conception of God?" That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. I saw that growth could start from that point. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would.
So Eddie says to him, why don't you choose your own conception of God? So what he's saying is, you don't have to believe what I believe. You don't have to believe what the Oxford Group believes. You get to choose your own conception of what this higher power is. And this becomes a really fundamental part of the AA 12-step program. AA doesn't tell me what to believe, but it does suggest I need to believe in something. But that thing is up to each individual person. Now, I've met lots of people in AA with all sorts of different beliefs. People talk about God being a group of drunks. A group of us is more powerful than me on my own. Or God being good, orderly direction. Or God is the great outdoors. Or God is the gift of desperation. Bill gets this hope, okay? He's got to a point of hopelessness. He's been trying to stop for so long and failing. This is the moment in time when Bill takes the second step. He's been given hope by Ebby. He says, would I have it? Of course I would. Now, he didn't stop drinking straight away. For the next few days, Ebby took him along to some Oxford Group meetings. Bill kept drinking. He was annoyed that they wouldn't let him speak in the meetings because he'd been drinking. But eventually, a few days later, he gets to a point, okay, I'm going to stop again. And he did the right thing. He went back into hospital, back into Towns Hospital to detox. And so he was in there and going through that few days, and then Ebby came in and saw him. And Bill went through that same process of admitting defeat, and he took an inventory and he shared his inventory with Ebby. He became willing to change. He became willing to make amends. And that's all described in the book, in his story. And Bill had this very sudden and profound spiritual experience that he talked about for the rest of his life. This is what he said.
These were revolutionary and drastic proposals, but the moment I fully accepted them, the effect was electric. There was a sense of victory, followed by such a peace and serenity as I had never known. There was utter confidence. I felt lifted up as though the great clean wind of a mountain top blew through and through. God comes to most men gradually, but his impact on me was sudden and profound.
So Bill had this very sudden and powerful experience of this higher power. As he said, this comes to most men gradually, and that was the case with me. As I go through the exercises, the spiritual exercises of the 12 steps, this change comes about. I do know some people in AA, quite a few people in AA. It still happens. Sudden, powerful experiences, but that's not what happens to most of us. I'm glad it happened that way to Bill, because that meant he was really enthusiastic and he wanted to go out and help other alcoholics. So he stayed sober for the next 6 months. And this became another fundamental part of the AA 12-step program, is that he stayed sober and he went out and tried to help other people stay sober. He complained, didn't get anyone else sober. He complained to his wife and she said, that's true, but the thing is you're staying sober by trying to help other people. He spoke to Dr. Silkworth about it, and Dr. Silkworth said, no, your problem is you keep on talking about this spiritual experience. But the first thing you need to do when you talk to another alcoholic is talk to them about the illness and get that connection. And then they might be interested in talking about your spiritual solution. So Bill's now 6 months sober, and he's trying to make all his millions back again. He and a group of other people put together a deal. We're going to go to Akron in Ohio, and take over this tire and rubber company. And Bill was going to be made president of the company, and he was going to be back on his feet financially, and everything was going to be wonderful again. But they weren't able to raise enough money and buy enough shares to get the votes to kick out the old board. And so Bill's almost broke. And 6 months sober, he's in Akron, doesn't really know anyone in Akron. He goes back to the hotel lobby this particular day, and he says in his story, down one end of the lobby was a bar, and you could hear people having a drink and having a good time, and that started to appeal to him. But then he knew he'd had that spiritual experience and didn't want to drink, so instead he went to the other end of the lobby and found a telephone and started phoning up hospitals and churches there in Akron and saying, I'm an alcoholic from New York and I don't want to drink, I need to talk to another alcoholic. Must have been a strange sort of phone call to get. Had to try pretty hard to do it, but he eventually got put onto this guy. We know him in AA as Dr. Bob. He was another alcoholic who'd been trying to stop for some time and hadn't been able to. And when he got this call, he said, I'll speak to this guy for 15 minutes, that's all. But when they got together, Bill started to talk to him about his own illness and the disease of alcoholism. And Dr. Bob said, that's the first time I've met anyone who really understands this. And they spoke for 6 hours. Now, once again, Dr. Bob tried to stop drinking, and then he had a little relapse, and then he went through that process of admitting defeat, and he took an inventory. He shared his inventory with Bill. He became willing to change. He became willing to make amends, and Dr. Bob got sober. One of the first things they did was go and try and find someone else, and Bill D, who was a lawyer in hospital in Akron, he went through that process. He got sober as well, and then it started to grow. This little group in Akron, and then Bill went back to New York and started another group of people starting to getting sober in New York. And then another group started down the road from Akron in Cleveland, Ohio. And when there was about 100 of them sober, they wrote a book about how they did it. And this is the book that we still use as the basis for the AA program. And then once they wrote the book, and they got some really great publicity. Remember, but before this, here's the most prominent psychiatrist in the world, Carl Jung, who has never seen a chronic alcoholic recover. And now there's 100 of them. And so it started to spread right throughout North America and eventually across the world. It came to Australia in 1944 to Sydney and 1945 to Melbourne. So just 9 years after it started in the US, it came to Australia. It actually came to Australia before it got to England. I think it was US in North America, and then Ireland, and then Australia, and then England and the rest of Europe. And now it's this worldwide organisation, it's this worldwide fellowship. I shouldn't use the word organisation because we're not well organised. By tradition, we're not well organised. It's a worldwide fellowship. This is the International AA Convention in San Antonio, Texas in 2010. There's 64,000 AA members in that one meeting. The ones down the front, that little group there, are all over 60 years sober. And that's Chris and I there. That's where we are. We were there. It was amazing when they did the Serenity Prayer. So it started there in North America, in Akron, well, with Ebby talking to Bill, and then Bill talking to Bob, and then on from there. And so these are the 12 steps that they came up with.
Step 1. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. 4. Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5. Admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. 7. Humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. 8. Made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. 9. Made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. 10. Continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. 11. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him, praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. Step 12. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs.
So there they are. They took those ideas from the Oxford group and expanded them out and put them in order and numbered them to make it easier for alcoholics. They took out some of the more religious words, like the Oxford group talked about sin and used the word confession. And so this doesn't use that sort of word. It doesn't use the word sin. It talks about defects of character, more sort of psychological terms. It does, of course, talk about God, but wherever it's talking about God, it's talking about God as we understood him, meaning each individual member's understanding of what that higher power is. Now, because they were so successful, people with other types of addiction, other sorts of problems noticed that and said, can we apply it to other things? So you've got Narcotics Anonymous started in the 1950s, Gamblers Anonymous and non-chemical addiction also started in the 1950s. The principles are the same. Some of the wording's a bit different, like the gamblers put in a financial inventory, that not in the AA 12 steps, but the principles are the same. And then there's Al-Anon, which is for the families of alcoholics. I can remember when I realised that Al-Anon's first step is the same as AA's. Al-Anon's first step is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. And I realised my ex-wife was absolutely powerless over my drinking. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she nagged, no matter how hard she tried to help me out, she wasn't able to stop me drinking. And then I realised, oh, hang on, I'm powerless over alcohol. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much willpower I tried to apply, I couldn't stop myself drinking. So step 2 is this one, where we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Now, I want to make sure that we're really clear about what it's saying when it says restored to sanity. I drank for 17 years, and those last 3 years of trying to stop failing, ended up in this halfway house in Bendigo, homeless, and forced to go to AA to keep a roof over my head.
How old were you then?
I was 34. I didn't look like this at all. I didn't have the white beard and stuff. I was much younger, a lot thinner, and very, very sick at the time. But I quickly identified with being powerless. But then I come into AA, and step 2 promises that I can be restored to sanity. So what's that like? What's it like to be powerless? Here's part of what it says in the book.
We alcoholics are men and women who have lost the ability to control our drinking. We know that no real alcoholic ever recovers control. All of us felt at times that we were regaining control, but such intervals, usually brief, were inevitably followed by still less control, which led in time to pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization. We are convinced to a man that alcoholics of our type are in the grip of a progressive illness. Over any considerable period, we get worse, never better.
So that's the first part, that lack of control over alcohol, and also the progressive part of it. Over time, it gets worse.
The fact is that most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink, as so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. We are unable at certain times to bring into our consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. We are without defence against the first drink. The almost certain consequences that follow taking even a glass of beer do not crowd into the mind to deter us. If these thoughts occur, they are hazy and readily supplanted with the old threadbare idea that this time we shall handle ourselves like other people. There is a complete failure of the kind of defence that keeps one from putting his hand on a hot stove.
I identified with that. I've lost the power of choice. I had no defence against that first drink. So that's what it's like to be powerless. So what's it like to be restored to sanity? Now, fortunately, in the book, it actually gives us a description of that. They're known as the 10th step promises. Notice they're not the 2nd step promises, they're the 10th step promises. There's some stuff I've got to do before I get there. But this is how it's described in the book.
And we have ceased fighting anything or anyone, even alcohol. For by this time sanity will have returned. We are seldom be interested in liquor. If tempted, we recoil from it as from a hot flame. We react sanely and normally, and we'll find that this has happened automatically. We'll see that our new attitude toward liquor has been given us without any thought or effort on our part. It just comes. That is the miracle of it. We are not fighting it, neither are we avoiding temptation. We feel as though we have been placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. We've not even sworn off. Instead, the problem has been removed. It does not exist for us. We are neither cocky nor are we afraid. That is our experience. That is how we react so long as we keep in fit spiritual condition.
So what a huge contrast. On one side, powerless over alcohol, can't control it, can't stop and stay stopped, to by the time I get to step 10, sanity has been returned. Seldom interested in liquor, but even if it does come to mind, it's easily pushed aside. And that's our experience of this program. We've been restored to sanity. as long as we stay in fit spiritual condition. So the first step we saw last week is a simple question. Am I powerless over alcohol? I break it down like this. Does my drinking go out of control once I start? Tick. That's me. So have I decided to stop? Yes, I made that same decision that I didn't want to drink anymore. And then the third question, have I kept picking up a drink despite my efforts to stop? Tick, tick, tick. That's my step one. When I really accept that that's true, I'm powerless. Step two is a process, as coming to believe. It's a process of coming to believe. The book says the actions that I take in order to take step two is to put aside prejudice and look at the evidence. That's the action I take in order to take step two. Put aside prejudice and look at the evidence. So where's the evidence?
Here are thousands of men and women, worldly indeed. They flatly declare that since they have come to believe in a power greater than themselves, to take a certain attitude toward that power, and to do certain simple things, there's been a revolutionary change in their way of living and thinking. In the face of collapse and despair, in the face of the total failure of their human resources, they found that a new power, peace, happiness, and sense of direction flowed into them. This happened soon after they wholeheartedly met a few simple requirements. Once confused and baffled by the seeming fertility of existence, they show the underlying reasons why they were making heavy going of life. Leaving aside the drink question, they tell why living was so unsatisfactory. They show how the change came over them. Where many hundreds of people are able to say that the consciousness of the presence of God is today the most important fact of their lives, they present a powerful reason why one should have faith.
So where's the evidence that it works? Well, it's in the book, but it's in AA meetings. I remember being in this rehab, to keep a roof over my head, I've got to go to at least 3 meetings. I started going to the meetings. I actually liked the meetings because there were friendly people there. Gave me a cup of coffee, told me some interesting stories and some funny stories and some tragic stories. And they said, keep coming back. And I actually decided I liked going to the meetings better than staying back at the rehab because with the other guys who were just as sick as me. Someone said to me, don't go to the meeting on a Monday night in Bendigo because it's a steps meeting and you're not ready for that because they read out of the book. So I went, okay? No one's going to tell me what not to do. And this particular meeting ran a series of meetings over 13 weeks. The first week was about step 1, the second week, step 2, right through 12 weeks. And the 13th week, they always had what they called a spiritual concept meeting where people talked about their idea about what the higher power is and how that had worked in their lives and in their recovery. And it happened that the first Monday night meeting I went to there in Bendigo all those years ago was the last meeting. It was a spiritual concept meeting. That's what people were talking about, their ideas about a higher power and God. And I remember going back to the rehab and me and this other guy, we agreed with each other that this was a whole lot of nonsense, this whole idea of a spiritual program, and that old bloke doesn't know what he's talking about. And we congratulated each other how smart we were that we weren't sucked in.
Yeah.
Smart guys sitting homeless in the rehab, okay? Anyway, but there was something about the meeting. So I went back the following week. Now, the following week, they were starting a new series and talked about step 1. And they talked about the craving, and they talked about the obsession, and they talked about the insanity, and they talked about the powerlessness. And when they talked about that, I believed every word they said because their experience matched mine. Following week, I went back again. Now, the next week, now we're back at step 2. They're talking about finding a power greater than ourselves. They're reading out of this chapter, we're agnostics. And once again, I went back to the rehab. I'm agreeing with this other guy out loud when he's saying, this is all nonsense, can't believe all this. Now, I'm agreeing with him out loud because I didn't want to look like an idiot. But I can actually remember thinking, and this was a different thought for me, I actually started to think to myself, maybe I'm wrong. When I was at that AA meeting the week before and they talked about step 1 and the powerlessness and the illness and all of that, I believed everything those AA members said because they're alcoholics like me. And now those same members, those same people are in this meeting saying that they came to believe in a power greater than themselves, that they took a certain attitude to that power and did certain simple things. And when they did that, there was a revolutionary change in their way of living and thinking, and they no longer kept on picking up that drink. So that's my second step. For Bill, it was Eddie sitting across his kitchen table. For me, it was a bunch of people sitting around a table, reading from this book and sharing their own experience. If it was just the book, oh, that's fine, a bunch of people all those years ago in another other side of the world. What convinced me were the people in the meeting sitting across me around that table. And I couldn't not believe. I couldn't not believe because there was the evidence. So, do I believe that this program works? I can break the second step down to this. Do I believe the spiritual work program works? I had to say yes because the evidence was sitting there in the room. Second question, do I believe it can work for me? Now, for some of us, that can be a bit of a stumbling block. I start thinking, I'm different in that some way. I drank more than they did, or I'm smarter than them, or I'm different in some sort of way. Good reason to go to lots of meetings, get lots of evidence. I meet people older than me, younger than me, better educated, less educated, richer, poorer, all sorts of backgrounds, all saying the same thing. They're getting sober with this spiritual program. So I start to believe, well, it can work for me. Maybe. And that's all it was for me. The first step I took 100%. The second step was just, it's working for lots of other people. Maybe that can work for me. And so that leads me to the next step and making a decision, where step 3 made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him.
Many of us exclaimed, "What an order! I can't go through with it." Do not be discouraged. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. We are not saints. The point is that we are willing to grow along spiritual lines. The principles we have set down are guides to progress. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. Our description of the alcoholic, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear 3 pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And C, that God could and would if he was sought.
So there's the answer. And it doesn't even say that I need to find God. It's about seeking God. So how do I do that? I make that decision in step 3. To me, that decision is a decision to seek a spiritual path in life. Whatever that means might be slightly different for different people depending on what their concept of that higher power. But I'd never sort of done this before, so I needed some guidance. I remember by this time I'm getting really excited. I'd lost hope before I got to AA. But now I've got hope for the first time in a long time. And I remember going to a meeting on a Wednesday in Bendigo, went to the only daytime meeting, and afterwards I went out for some coffee with some people. I'm really getting excited. Maybe this can work for me. I knew if I left that rehab and nothing had changed, I was going to drink again. I didn't want that to happen. So I was given this hope. But I thought, I've got to find God. So I'll go to the local cathedral and I'll find him there because that's where he lives. But by the time I got there, it was after 4:00 and it was closed. So this was the cathedral just around the corner from this little halfway house rehab. So I walked back to the rehab, and on the way there, I made a decision. Tomorrow morning when I get up, I'm going to try this AA thing, whatever it means. I'm not sure what it means, but I'm going to try the AA way. And even at that moment, there was a lightness in my step, and I'm thinking, I'm going to try something really radical and different because I've seen it work for other people. Next morning, I got up and I found this prayer that I'd heard read out in the meeting about step 3.
We are now at step 3. Many of us said to our Maker as we understood him, "God, I offer myself to thee to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help with thy power, thy love and thy way of life. May I do thy will always." We thought well before taking this step, making sure we were ready, that we could at last abandon ourselves utterly to him. We found it very desirable to take this spiritual step with an understanding person, such as our wife, best friend, or spiritual advisor. But it is better to meet God alone than with one who might misunderstand. The wording was, of course, quite optional, so long as we expressed the idea, voicing it without reservation. This was only a beginning, though if honestly and humbly made, an effect, sometimes a very great one, was felt at once.
I like the idea that the wording was optional. I didn't like all the these and thous, that really religious language. I probably still don't, but that's my prejudice. But I knew there was something different about this prayer. Most prayers I knew as a kid, and even the Serenity Prayer in AA, are about asking God for something. This starts out by offering something. So you may have heard of 3 frogs sitting on a log. One of them makes a decision, I'm going to jump off the log. Great decision, okay? How many frogs are still on the log? Well, still 3, until he takes some action. So the decision on its own has little permanent effect unless at once followed by action. So how do we do that? How do we seek a spiritual path? Well, step 3 is a decision to go on with the rest of the program. This is where I started out, powerless over alcohol. This is where I want to get to. This is where step 2 promises I can get to, restored to sanity. Step 1 is simply admitting that this is true. Step 2 then is believing it's possible. Then step 3 is a decision to go on with the process. And the process is the same as these middle steps, often known as the house cleaning steps, the same that Roland did with the Oxford group and Ebby did with Roland and Bill did with Ebby and Bob did with Bill, and on and on. Same process. Taking inventory and sharing it with someone else in steps 4 and 5, being ready to change and praying for help in steps 6 and 7, looking for the harm we've done and making amends in steps 8 and 9. And where I really want to get to is this 10th step, because as we've seen, by that time, sanity has been returned. I'm now living in the solution. Then those last 3 become my way of staying in fit spiritual condition, continuing inventory on a daily basis, step 10, some prayer and meditation in step 11, practicing these spiritual principles. But the most powerful thing I can do to stay sober long term is why we do this, is carrying this message and helping the next person.
Thanks, David. As I said before, I started drinking again when I was in Bendigo, and the girls were pretty devastated about that. And I continued to drink for another 9 months and did more damage. When Melissa, she was 15, and she said to me, I'm not going to stick around here and watch you die. And she left, and she went on the streets of Bendigo, and I couldn't find her, and eventually found her and got her to go to my sister's place in Queensland. And Wendy was trying to stay away from me as much as possible. All we did was argue, and it was really hard work. It was just getting harder. And I just didn't know how to stay stopped. I was really trying to control it, and I was quickly failing again. And my drinking was starting to escalate again. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't stay stopped. And I started meeting people in Alcoholics Anonymous and saw that they actually got sober and stayed sober. And I thought, yeah, but my life's different to yours. If you had my life, you'd still be drinking. It was all that sort of stuff. But eventually, alcohol beat me up. Eventually, I just got too sick and too tired, and too sick and too tired of being sick and tired and all that stuff. And I'd almost given up giving up. But I had this hope because I'd met people who were sober. And so I came into Alcoholics Anonymous. Melissa came back to live with me because I was sober, and I wasn't fighting as much with Wendy anymore. I got really stuck into the 12 steps because I knew if I didn't change, I was going to drink again. And I didn't have any sort of spiritual beliefs or anything. My poor old dad, he's a horse trainer, he's an Aussie battler, and every now and again he'd get a bit pissed and he'd go out in the paddock and he'd say, if you're up there, you bastard, come down so I can hit you. And that was my religious upbringing. I didn't have a lot of prejudice, but I didn't have a lot of knowledge either. But when I got to step 2, I was at a meeting and there was all these people sitting around, and all they wanted was me to stay sober. They didn't know me, but they wished me to stay sober. They were praying for me to stay sober. So that was my higher power. That was my sort of first introduction to it. So I grabbed hold of that. And really quickly, things changed. Life got better. I started paying back the money. I wasn't owing rent anymore. I was getting better jobs. And this was a really short period of time. And I thought, gosh, my 2 daughters were talking to me. My other 2 children were coming to visit, and I was sober when they got there. And my ex-husband wasn't yelling and screaming at me anymore. And I thought, this is just what sobriety's supposed to be. And then Wendy and Melissa were in a car crash on the 1st of January 1997. I was 14 months sober, and they were both killed instantly. They were 16 and 17. And it was a devastating thing to happen, of course. But I didn't fucking think it was going to happen to me. I didn't think it was going to happen to us. It's not what our family was supposed to look forward to. And I didn't know what to do. I just didn't know what to do. And I had all these people coming around from Alcoholics Anonymous and supporting me. And so here's this fellowship. And within half an hour of hearing the news, my sponsor was there, David's sponsor was at our flat. There was a lot of people that supported us. And I was able to bury my daughters with grace and dignity. And I stayed sober. It was because I'd had this spiritual experience. It's because I had this spiritual awakening, or else I wouldn't have stayed sober. You know, I would drink because somebody else's kid would get sick. And so I knew that this program really worked on that day, and the days and the weeks and the months and the years that followed. The thing I really did was throw myself into service. I was going to rehabs and detoxes and telling my story of recovery, of being able not to drink. And things got different. They never got better, but they got different. And I didn't drink and I stayed sober. My other two children came to live with us because I was sober and they felt safe. David's 3 kids came to live with us, so we had 5 teenagers in the house and I still didn't drink. And then they all moved out again. And so David and I moved to St Kilda and we loved it. It was a different lifestyle. We opened meetings, we got on with the program and we helped others. And I started to feel whole again. It's a terrible thing when my daughters were my best friends and we went through a lot together. And then in 2007, my son, he's now 26 and he's beautiful and he's got some mates coming over from Perth and they're going to go to a party out in the country. And so he goes and picks them up from the airport and then we get a call that he's been in the crash and he's the passenger in the car. The driver hadn't been drinking but was known for his speeding and hit the paddock at 160 k's and they rolled 8 times. And miraculously, Grant survived. He was airlifted to the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and then days later we found out that Marcus, the driver, had been killed, and he was his best friend. David and I were in India at the time, and again, I'm in a situation I don't know what to do. And so I just pray and I talk to members and I talk to the hospital and I try and do the next right thing. We get back to Melbourne. And he survived, and we were very, very lucky that he had survived. The bones mended and the bruises went away, but psychologically he was really damaged, and we didn't know what was going to be his future. At the same time, my youngest daughter came to live with us. She brought her 6-month-old son with her. She was just 21. And 20 when she came to live with us, and she'd grown up a lot. She'd gone through a lot. She'd lost her sisters. She was estranged from her father, and now she had a 6-month-old baby. And we readily said yes, you know, when she asked to come to us. And it was a great joy to have her and her son. And you know, life happens, it does. Life can be really good and life can give you a lot of stuff to manage. And when Nikki was just 21, she was the passenger in the car. I don't know what it is about car crashes and I don't know why my children had to suffer. But when the car hit a pole, Nikki ended up with a catastrophic brain injury. And we were in the Alfred Hospital in ICU, and we didn't know what to expect. We didn't know whether she was going to live or die. And again, the fellowship gathered around us. Again, people said, can I help? And because of this program, I said yes. And so we were able to get through those months of Nikki being in a vegetative state and having a catastrophic brain injury. She never walked or talked again. She was never able to tell me she loved me again or hold her son again. But we did it the best that we could. Was I in fit spiritual condition? Fuck knows, you know, but I didn't drink. I was angry and hurt and cried for 2 years, but I didn't drink. And I had a lot of people around me that were supporting me. And I'd say yes when people said, can we help? No, we were able to get Nikki home full time with her son so he could grow up with her. And we had 12 people looking after her at times. She was 24 care. And, it was, the essence of her was still there. She never, as I said, she never walked and talked, but she laughed. And I sort of figure if she gets the joke of life, then I do too. And we were able to be part of her life, and she was able to be part of ours. And we had lots of people looking after her, and lots of people being part of her life and part of our life. And David's kids, they were all part of her life as well. And then in 2015, Nikki died, and I stood and I didn't drink. It's not because I'm any stronger than any other mother. It's not because I'm any different than anybody else. But I do have this 12-step program, which enables me to turn my attention to someone I can help. And that gets me out of myself. It gives me a purpose. And that's what happened. Through all, the last 27 years of sobriety, I've had this purpose. And that was to stay sober and help others, and to turn my attention towards that instead of towards me. We have the privilege of raising our grandson. And of course, he's on the spectrum. He has ADHD and he's a handful. And we said yes, because that's what we do. Because that's what you do when you're on a spiritual path. You say yes. And he's been hard work, but he's lots of opportunities for growth with young Blake. He's currently in Malaysia, so he's over there with his support worker at the moment, and he's had a ball. This is a kid who won't even go to the corner shop, but he's in Malaysia, and it's amazing. I'm scared, I'm terrified for him, but I have this program, and I have faith that he's going to be okay. If he's not, we'll get through that too, because that's what this program gives us. Grant, we just didn't know what he was going to do. We didn't know how hard he was going to live. After Nikki's crash, he went into, used a lot of stuff, used a lot of drugs and alcohol. And he came to me when he was 30 and he said, Mum, I just wanted to kill myself. And all I had was the big book and a meeting for him to go to. He'd grown up around me. He saw me get sober and he trusted this program, but he wasn't ready until he was ready. He went to a meeting. He's now been sober for 10 years and clean, doesn't use anything. And he's a teacher of yoga, lived in Bali for a lot of years. He's currently in Thailand, living the life. He loves his life. When he got sober, he did a degree in psychology, and I said, that's great because his whole family suffers with PTSD and we need all the help we can get. And graduated and then went to Bali. I said, what about your university degree? He said, Mum, I just love my life. And that's all I wanted for him. That's all we want for our children and our loved ones and ourselves. By going through this program, I get to stay sober. And this program gives me the opportunity to turn my attention to someone else I can help. Gives me a purpose. So then life gets better. And life can be different. And this, as David said, this is why we do this. This is Grant, by the way. Isn't he beautiful? He's 41 now. He still looks like that. But it's a great privilege to do these workshops. So thank you so much for allowing us to share. If this helps you or gives you some hope, that's great. But I assure you, it gives us so much. We get so much out of doing this. So thank you for being part of our sobriety.